For decades, Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford appeared to embody something increasingly rare in the modern public sphere: longevity without scandal. They were not merely married, they were reliable. Their relationship felt like a fixed point in an industry built on reinvention and instability. Viewers trusted them in the same way one trusts the morning routine itself: predictable, comforting, quietly affirming that some things really do last. So when the announcement came that their marriage was ending, it landed not as gossip but as rupture. There had been no visible warning signs. No explosive interviews. No leaked messages. No whispered allegations circulating ahead of time. The split arrived stripped of drama, and paradoxically, that restraint made it more shocking. Ruth Langsford spoke first. Her account was measured, calm, and emotionally economical. She framed the end of the marriage as something organic rather than catastrophic: two people who had simply grown apart over time, whose paths no longer aligned in the way they once had. There were no villains in her telling, only inevitability. And because Ruth had long been perceived as grounded, practical, and emotionally literate, her explanation felt not just plausible but authoritative. The public accepted it almost immediately. Eamonn Holmes, by contrast, said nothing. In public life, silence is never neutral. It invites interpretation, speculation, projection. In the absence of contradiction, Ruth's version hardened into consensus. Eamonn's refusal to respond did not read as dignity, it read as evasion. His quiet became evidence. His absence from the narrative was interpreted as an admission of guilt, or at the very least, an inability to defend himself. But silence, as Eamonn would later reveal, was not confession. It was survival. To understand how a marriage that appeared so stable could collapse so completely, and why its aftermath unfolded the way it did, it is necessary to examine not the ending, but the structure on which the relationship was built. Because what millions mistook for intimacy may, over time, have become something closer to performance. Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford did not merely share a private life, they shared a professional one. Their relationship was forged, developed, and sustained in a workplace that rewarded chemistry and punished disruption. They met on television, fell in love on television, married while working together, and then spent years broadcasting their partnership to an audience that felt emotionally invested in their dynamic. Each morning, viewers watched them sit side by side, trading jokes, anticipating each other's thoughts, finishing sentences with ease that suggested deep familiarity. It felt authentic because it was familiar, rehearsed familiarity, refined over thousands of hours of live broadcasting. But comfort should not be mistaken for closeness. In the early years, before the cameras became omnipresent, there may well have been a private intimacy that belonged solely to them. Quiet mornings. Unscripted conversations. Shared experiences that were not curated for public consumption. Yet television has a unique way of absorbing relationships into itself. When your livelihood depends on being charming together 5 days a week, charm ceases to be spontaneous. It becomes procedural. You learn what works. You learn which stories earn laughter. You learn which expressions the camera lingers on. You learn which version of yourselves the audience wants. Over time, that version begins to dominate. It becomes easier to inhabit than the unpolished, complicated reality beneath it. Eventually, it may even replace it. Eamonn and Ruth were consummate professionals. They understood the demands of broadcast chemistry, how to sound effortless while hitting precise marks, how to disagree playfully without generating tension, how to perform intimacy without exposing vulnerability. Their marriage became seamless because it had been practiced endlessly. But when a relationship also becomes a brand, it becomes difficult to distinguish between what is real and what is merely effective. You stop asking whether you are genuinely happy and start asking whether you look happy. And when millions of people believe the image, the pressure to maintain it becomes immense. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. There were no public arguments, no scandals, no rumors of betrayal. Their partnership seemed inevitable, two people so intertwined that separation felt unimaginable. Yet inevitability is not the same as love. Often, it is simply familiarity that has endured long enough to feel permanent. The danger of performing a marriage is subtle but profound. When the performance becomes routine, curiosity dies. You stop checking in because you believe you already know the answers. You stop asking difficult questions because they would disrupt the rhythm. Growth becomes a threat rather than a necessity. Gradually, Eamonn and Ruth stopped talking about what truly mattered. Conversations narrowed to logistics, schedules, and public-facing decisions. Emotional inquiry, how are you really feeling, what do you need, what are you afraid of, fell away. Those questions were too complex, too destabilizing for a couple whose professional lives depended on appearing unified and untroubled. For years, the performance held. Until it didn't. When the divorce announcement finally arrived, it came without context or explanation. A short statement. Neutral language. A definitive ending. And immediately, the question emerged, who would control the story? Because when a relationship collapses in public, the narrative becomes almost as important as the truth itself. Ruth's version of events did not spread through dramatic confession. It traveled quietly, efficiently, through trusted intermediaries. Friends spoke to journalists. Sources, close to the couple, offered insight. Each account echoed the same themes: inevitability, mutual drift, dignified closure. It was a masterclass in narrative management. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She simply positioned herself as reasonable. And in doing so, she allowed the public to draw its own conclusions, conclusions that overwhelmingly favored her. Eamonn's silence completed the picture. Why would an innocent man remain quiet? Why would someone with another side of the story not defend himself? In the absence of answers, people supplied their own. His quiet was recast as emotional distance, guilt, or avoidance. Sympathy flowed toward Ruth, whose composure under pressure reinforced her credibility. By the time Eamonn was prepared to speak, the story was no longer fluid. It had set. And once a narrative hardens into accepted truth, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. Eamonn did not remain silent because he had nothing to say. He stayed silent because he understood the mechanics of public judgment. Any attempt to explain himself would be filtered through Ruth's framing, reduced to headlines, and weaponized for entertainment. Silence felt safer than distortion. But silence extracts a brutal price. With each passing day, assumptions solidified. Friends grew cautious. Colleagues kept professional distance. The public filled the void with speculation, labeling him emotionally absent, cold, secretive. His refusal to deny these claims was taken as confirmation. This is the paradox of public silence: it protects you from saying the wrong thing, but it cannot protect you from becoming whatever others decide. Eamonn watched strangers explain his life with confident authority. Television therapists analyzed his character. Columnists diagnosed his failings. None of them had lived inside his marriage, yet all spoke as if they understood it completely. The result was a profound isolation, not merely reputational, but existential. To be publicly misunderstood is to watch yourself become a character in someone else's story, one that bears little resemblance to who you know yourself to be. And still, he remained quiet. Because at that moment, something else was already dismantling his life from the inside out, something far more disabling than public opinion. Long before the marriage formally ended, Eamonn Holmes' body began to betray him. At first, the symptoms were small enough to ignore: an ache in his back, a stiffness that lingered longer than it should have. The kind of discomfort men of a certain age are taught to dismiss as inconvenience rather than warning. He did what many do: worked through it, medicated it, postponed acknowledging what was happening. But pain that is ignored does not disappear. It reorganizes your life. The stiffness deepened into chronic agony, not explosive or theatrical, but persistent, grinding, and unforgiving. It reshaped the most basic aspects of his existence: how long he could sit, how carefully he had to stand, how much sleep he could get, whether he could endure a full day at work without paying for it afterward. Pain became the invisible variable in every decision. Chronic illness does not arrive as a single catastrophe. It colonizes slowly. One small compromise becomes another until the life you remember feels impossibly distant. Stairs become obstacles. Chairs become negotiations. Even rest becomes strategic, rationed carefully to survive what comes next. With reduced mobility came reduced independence. Tasks that once required no thought, getting dressed, carrying groceries, moving freely through familiar spaces, now demanded assistance. An assistance, however lovingly offered, changes the geometry of a relationship. This is where illness becomes relational rather than medical. Ruth Langsford stepped into the role of caregiver with competence and efficiency. She organized appointments, managed medication schedules, researched specialists. To the outside world, and initially to Eamonn himself, this looked like devotion. The image fit neatly into her public persona, capable, steady, unflappable. And at first, it was care. But care alters relationships in ways that are rarely discussed honestly. When one partner becomes dependent, vulnerability deepens, but so does imbalance. The person who provides assistance gains authority, not through cruelty, but through necessity. They become the interpreter of limits, the arbiter of what is possible, the gatekeeper of daily life. Eamonn found himself relying on Ruth not just emotionally, but practically. She drove him where he needed to go. She made decisions when pain drained his energy. She spoke for him when exhaustion made conversation difficult. Gradually, dependence hardened into structure. Requests turned into negotiations. Preferences were weighed against practicality. His needs were filtered through what was deemed reasonable. His body, once simply his own, became the justification for decisions he no longer fully controlled. When someone governs your physical reality, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to recognize when they begin governing everything else. The transition was subtle. Almost invisible. Ruth began suggesting which events he should skip because they would be too tiring. She managed social invitations, deciding which ones were worth the effort and which would only exhaust him. She structured his schedule with precision, framing every choice around his well-being. And because her logic was always sensible, resistance felt selfish. How could he argue when she was the one managing the logistics? How could he insist on autonomy when he could barely manage his own pain? Each concession felt temporary. Each compromise felt reasonable. But together, they formed a pattern. This is how control embeds itself inside care. It does not arrive with commands. It arrives with concern. Every boundary crossed is framed as protection. Every decision made on your behalf is justified as being for your own good. If you resist, you are not asserting independence, you are being difficult. Eamonn noticed that conversations about what he wanted were slowly replaced by conversations about what was realistic. What would be easier? What made sense? What would reduce strain for everyone involved? His preferences began to feel indulgent next to Ruth's efficiency. Control does not require isolation to be obvious. It often presents itself as organization. Ruth increasingly mediated Eamonn's access to the outside world. She decided who he saw and when. How long visits should last. Which phone calls were worth the emotional energy. Which conversations might upset him unnecessarily. Each choice, taken alone, seemed thoughtful. Together, they narrowed his world. Gradually, his social life became filtered through her judgment. Friends faded not because of conflict, but because contact required negotiation. Spontaneity disappeared. Every interaction had to pass through a lens of feasibility and fatigue. The most insidious part was that none of it resembled abuse. It looked like commitment. Ruth was praised for her patience, admired for her endurance. She was seen as a woman who stayed when others might have walked away. And Eamonn began to understand the paradox of being cared for too completely. It erases you. Home is meant to be the place where performance ends. Where you can exist without explanation. For Eamonn, the house they shared slowly became a place of vigilance. He could not pinpoint when it began. There was no single argument, no dramatic shift. It was the accumulation of small moments, Ruth appearing unexpectedly during phone calls, casual questions that revealed knowledge he had not shared, comments that suggested a level of awareness that felt intrusive. When he expressed discomfort, it was reframed as concern. She worried because she had to. His health required attention. Vigilance was necessary. Privacy became suspect. Boundaries became unnecessary. So he adapted. He stopped making phone calls when she was home. He stopped expressing opinions that would lead to debates he no longer had the stamina to endure. He avoided spaces that once felt his own because even those no longer felt private. This is emotional confinement. It does not require locks or threats. It only requires constant observation and the erosion of spontaneity. You begin to edit yourself automatically, until you forget you are doing it at all. From the outside, the house looked unchanged. The same furniture. The same photographs. The same routines. Inside, the atmosphere had thickened into something tense and airless. Eamonn retreated into a small office, the last space that felt remotely his, but even there he sensed her awareness, the subtle disapproval in her questions. Why so much time alone? What was he doing in there? And perhaps he was hiding something. He was hiding the realization that he was trapped. The moment that shattered the illusion was not a confrontation. It was overheard. Eamonn had been resting upstairs when Ruth's voice carried from the kitchen below. She was on the phone, relaxed in a way she no longer was around him. He had not intended to listen, but once he recognized that she was talking about him, tension became unavoidable. She described his limitations with clinical detachment. His pain was framed as inconvenience. His needs as excess. His presence as something to be managed rather than cherished. What devastated him was not the content, but the tone. There was no affection. No tenderness. Only irritation, edged with something colder, contempt. In that moment, he understood that the version of care he experienced privately did not match the version of sacrifice she presented publicly. The devoted caregiver was also a performance. This is betrayal without spectacle. The sudden clarity that the person you trusted most has been acting, that gratitude was misplaced, that what felt like love was obligation hardened into resentment. When Ruth came upstairs later, Eamonn said nothing. He knew how the conversation would go. He would be told he misunderstood. That he was oversensitive. That medication distorted perception. Instead of arguing, he absorbed the truth. And once absorbed, it could not be undone. By the time the marriage officially ended, the emotional rupture had already occurred. What remained was not intimacy but logistics, how to conclude something so publicly visible without destabilizing the images that had sustained both careers for decades. The result was a divorce announcement so carefully engineered that it functioned less as explanation than erasure. The statement was brief, neutral, and impeccably composed. It acknowledged the end of the marriage, expressed mutual respect, and requested privacy. Nothing more. No reference to illness. No mention of imbalance or erosion. No acknowledgement of the years during which power quietly rearranged itself inside their home. In public relationships, endings are rarely honest. They are managed. This was not merely discretion, it was image preservation. Truth would have required complexity, and complexity would have disrupted the simplicity both parties needed to survive the aftermath. The polished neutrality of the statement allowed Ruth to retain her image as composed and dignified, and it allowed Eamonn to avoid the spectacle that would follow any attempt to explain himself. But politeness is not neutral. It can be violent in its own way. Because the sanitized ending left a vacuum, and vacuums demand to be filled. In the absence of detail, the public turned to what it already believed. Ruth's early framing, measured, calm, emotionally contained, became the default explanation. Eamonn's continued silence reinforced it. Each day he did not speak hardened assumptions into consensus. Friends struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the man described in headlines. Colleagues read body language at public events like forensic evidence. Fans debated online, assigning blame based on familiarity rather than knowledge. The silence was no longer protective. It had become punitive. Eamonn found himself living inside an identity he had not chosen. He was described as emotionally absent, withdrawn, resistant to accountability. His illness was reframed as retreat. His caution as coldness. His dignity as guilt. This is what happens when one person controls the narrative and the other declines to participate. Silence ceases to be absence, it becomes testimony. Public misunderstanding is not simply a reputational injury. It is psychological displacement. You are forced to watch strangers define you while your own understanding of yourself remains unseen. Eamonn could not correct the record without appearing defensive. He could not explain without being accused of rewriting history. Any attempt at nuance would be flattened into motive. And so he endured. He watched commentators debate the meaning of his behavior. He watched therapists analyze his supposed emotional failures. He watched articles speculate about masculinity, accountability, and emotional labor, all anchored to a version of events that bore little resemblance to his lived experience. None of these narratives included the reality of dependence. None accounted for what it means to lose agency gradually, under the guise of care. None acknowledged the psychological toll of being managed rather than partnered. The isolation deepened. When Eamonn eventually broke his silence, it was not with accusation. It was with description. He chose controlled environments, conversations with trusted journalists, carefully framed remarks, where speed and distortion were less likely. He did not name Ruth as an antagonist. He did not catalogue her failures. Instead, he articulated the experience of disappearance. He spoke about what it feels like to become smaller inside a relationship. About how chronic pain can strip not only mobility but authority. About how dependence alters the balance of power until one partner's strength becomes the other's confinement. He described the exhaustion of constant negotiation. The suffocation of perpetual observation. The fear of asserting autonomy when autonomy feels like ingratitude. This was not a performance of victimhood. It was an attempt at truth. The response was divided. Some began to reconsider. They recognized patterns they had seen before but rarely acknowledged when reversed, control disguised as care, power exercised without malice but with consequence. They understood that emotional erosion does not require intent to be real. Others rejected his account entirely. They framed it as revisionism, as retaliation, as the predictable response of a man unwilling to accept responsibility. Emotional abuse, they argued, was a convenient claim. And perhaps that rejection was inevitable. Once a narrative sets, truth must compete with belief. And belief, once comfortable, resists disturbance. Eamonn had waited too long. Or perhaps there was never a moment that would have been received differently. What his account ultimately exposed was not a villain but a structure. The slow redistribution of power within a marriage under pressure. Ruth's competence, long admired, had become decisive authority. Her strength, once stabilizing, had become overwhelming. Strength is not moral. It is instrumental. In relationships, the strongest partner often governs by default. Not through threat, but through capability. They know what needs doing. They make decisions efficiently. They justify control with results. And when the other partner is ill, exhausted, or diminished, resistance feels impossible. Eamonn did not lose himself through a single act of domination. He lost himself through accommodation. This is the quiet danger of long marriages built on performance, professionalism, and unequal resilience. When crisis arrives, the balance tips, and sometimes never recovers. Their marriage did not collapse in a moment. It ended long before the announcement, eroded by habit, fear, and the weight of public expectation. They stayed because leaving would have required honesty neither could yet afford. In the end, there were no winners. Only distance. Only silence. Only two people exiting wreckage they had both, in different ways, helped create. Some truths surface only after departure. Some honesty requires escape. And some stories remain unresolved, not because they lack meaning, but because meaning threatens the images we depend on to make sense of public lives. One of the reasons Eamonn Holmes' account struggled to gain traction is not found in the details of his story, but in the cultural framework through which it was received. Power, care, and vulnerability are not interpreted neutrally. They are filtered through expectation, and expectation is deeply gendered. Society is comfortable recognizing harm when it conforms to familiar scripts. Control is easy to identify when it is loud, aggressive, or visibly cruel. It is far harder to acknowledge when it is quiet, efficient, and wrapped in competence, especially when the person exercising it is a woman and the person diminished by it is a man. Caregiving is culturally coded as female virtue. Strength, organization, emotional regulation, these traits are celebrated when women display them, particularly in domestic contexts. Ruth's role as caregiver fit seamlessly into this narrative. She was not only expected to manage, she was praised for doing so. Eamonn, by contrast, occupied an uncomfortable position. He was ill, dependent, and increasingly uncertain. These qualities collide with traditional expectations of masculinity, which prize autonomy, stoicism, and self-sufficiency. His vulnerability did not read as vulnerability, it read as failure. This imbalance shaped how their marriage was interpreted long before either of them spoke publicly. When men describe emotional erosion, the response is often skepticism. The language of control and suffocation is assumed to belong to women's experiences. When men use it, it is frequently reframed as avoidance, weakness, or deflection. Eamonn's description of emotional confinement challenged a deeply entrenched assumption that power in relationships always flows in predictable directions. The idea that a competent, organized woman could inadvertently, or unconsciously, dominate a partnership does not align with popular narratives of harm. So his account was scrutinized not for coherence, but for motive. Was he exaggerating? Was he resentful? Was he trying to shift blame? These questions were asked reflexively, without the same rigor applied to Ruth's initial framing. Her calmness was interpreted as truth. His hesitation was interpreted as guilt. Tone mattered more than substance. Public sympathy is not distributed according to evidence, it is distributed according to presentation. Ruth's restraint read as dignity. Her emotional economy read as maturity. She did not over-explain, and that refusal itself became proof of her credibility. Eamonn's later attempts at articulation lacked that advantage. Any expression of pain risked being labeled self-pity. Any complexity risked being dismissed as confusion. His experience required interpretation, and interpretation requires patience, something public discourse rarely offers. Composure is not neutrality. It is power. The person who appears least affected is often assumed to be most truthful. But emotional restraint can just as easily be armor, a way of controlling perception by limiting access. In this case, composure shaped belief more decisively than facts ever could. Ruth's management of their life together was not framed as dominance but as emotional labor, an invisible, feminized form of work that society has only recently begun to acknowledge. Yet emotional labor, when unilateral, becomes authority. She decided what was sustainable. She interpreted his limits. She defined what was reasonable. And because her decisions produced order, they were rarely questioned. Efficiency became justification. This is the paradox of competence: the better you are at managing a situation, the harder it becomes for others to challenge your control over it. Eamonn's resistance, when it surfaced, lacked structural support. He could not point to a single act of cruelty. He could only describe a pattern. And patterns are easy to deny when they are composed of reasonable choices. Public discomfort with Eamonn's account was not about disbelief alone, it was about disruption. Accepting his version would require acknowledging that care can suffocate, that strength can dominate, and that harm does not always announce itself with intention. It would require expanding the vocabulary of abuse to include experiences that do not fit binary roles. That expansion threatens simplicity. So the narrative resisted. Even now, much of what happened inside that marriage remains unarticulated, not because it lacks clarity, but because clarity would destabilize too many assumptions. About gender. About caregiving. About power. Eamonn's story does not ask for vindication. It asks for recognition. It asks that we reconsider how easily we confuse calm with kindness, efficiency with love, and silence with guilt. And perhaps that is why it remains so contested. Because if his experience is acknowledged as real, then many others must be reconsidered as well. The end of the marriage did not bring immediate relief. For Eamonn Holmes, leaving was not an act of liberation but of recovery. Years of dependency and quiet erosion had altered his sense of self so thoroughly that freedom felt unfamiliar, even unsafe. When autonomy returns after prolonged confinement, it does not arrive as confidence, it arrives as disorientation. He had to relearn decision-making. Simple choices carried unexpected weight. Without someone else interpreting his limits, he was forced to confront them himself, and that confrontation was both frightening and necessary. Identity, once surrendered incrementally, does not reappear fully formed. It must be rebuilt deliberately. This is why departure is so often misunderstood. Outsiders see leaving as abandonment, ingratitude, or betrayal. They rarely see it as preservation. But staying would have meant the complete disappearance of self, a life defined entirely by accommodation and silence. Leaving was not rejection of care. It was refusal to vanish. The psychological cost of prolonged emotional diminishment lingers long after separation. Trust is slower. Boundaries feel fragile. But survival creates its own clarity. Some relationships do not end because love fails, but because endurance becomes self-destruction. And sometimes, the only honest act left is to walk away.